I was covering a protest and counter-protest in Portland, and things got a little heated. I was there as an editor and also as a contributor and a writer for my paper, and I had started to notice that the police were beginning to, I would say, push back against the counter-protesters at one point. And so I started to cover the counter-protesters. It was at some point during this pushback that I noticed that there was a lot of agitation from the police. And finally, they began throwing what are called flashbang grenades, which emit a lot of noise and light. And that's meant to cause people to move far back. After a while, what this does is cause dispersal. And so this dispersal ultimately led to a lot of the collected counter-protesters to decide that they were going to march away. After several flashbangs and pepper sprays, a good enough group began to march away. And along with this group were several observers from the ACLU, from the National Lawyers Guild, and quite a few reporters, myself included, my other reporters that were in my news team. One was Anna Williams and one was Jacob Johnson, who was assisting Anna Williams at the time. So I followed along with this group. I was hanging back a little bit because I had observed other matters within the protest area. And after I had observed these sort of winding down, I resumed following this group, and I was perhaps about 50 yards behind my reporters, Anna and Jake. Jake was not immediately adjacent to Anna, but he was close enough to see what she was doing. He had a line of sight. So I followed closely, and I got a message from Jake basically telling me that Anna was being detained. I went up there and I found out that Anna had been detained along with numerous reporters, ACLU observers, and others. So I had decided, after being nearly hit with flashbangs, getting a little bit of pepper spray on me, that, might as well get myself there and involved with the police to sort of rectify the situation with one of my reporters, because as an editor, I don't want to have my reporters troubled in the job. It would not be a good editor to actually just leave my reporters hanging like that. And so I actually approached one of the officers there and asked what I could do to have my reporter released. And they said, well, can you identify them? I said, I have line of sight with her right now. One of my other reporters has line of sight. And that other reporter said that you told him that if I identified her, that you would release her. And so I made every effort to convince them. And finally, this officer brought in another officer, and that officer directed me to someone of higher rank, a sergeant, across the street. I went across the street and I addressed this officer, this sergeant, and they said that there was nothing they could do. And I asked them, well, this is a reporter. And the response was, well, she shouldn't have been there in the first place. That, to me personally, as a journalist, as an editor, was a particularly galling statement to hear from an officer. And so I made every effort to convince this officer, and they simply were unrelenting. So finally, I unfortunately had to give up, because at that point they were lining up everybody. It turns out they were photographing people and basically excluding them from the area, regardless of whether they were an ACLU observer, a National Lawyers Guild observer, or a journalist. Finally, after my reporter was released, I left the area. my other reporter left the area, and we left the scene of the protest.